Thank you for listening to NSL Doubletalk.
Never stop learning.
At Never Stop Learning, we connect you with engaging experts who join you and your friends or colleagues in conversation at a location of your choosing. With NSL Doubletalk, we are bringing the Never Stop Learning model directly to you. Each podcast will feature 2 experts in conversation on topics that range from global affairs to wellness to arts to innovation. Sometimes the experts agree, sometimes they don't, but we will never stop learning and never stop laughing.
En español.
NSL Doubletalk featuring Lisa Sotto and Eric Friedberg. Their topic today is cybersecurity. Should we be concerned? Lisa has been named among the National Law Journal's 100 most influential lawyers, and she chairs Hunton's top-ranked global privacy and cybersecurity practice. Lisa serves as the chairperson of the Department of Homeland Security's Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee. She is the editor and lead author of the Privacy and Cybersecurity Law Deskbook. Eric has over 30 years of public and private sector experience in law, cybercrime response, IT security, forensics, investigations, and e-discovery. He has helped many Fortune 500 companies improve their governance and technology initiatives. We are so excited to welcome Lisa and Eric to NSL Doubletalk.
Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Eric.
How are you?
Terrific.
Good to see you. So we're going to have a nice talk today about cyber.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Why don't you kick it off?
All right. Well, why don't we start by explaining the difference between privacy and security, because I think there's always confusion as to what they both mean and the fact that they're distinct concepts. So when we think about data privacy, we think about the appropriate uses of data. How should data be collected, used, and disclosed? When we think about security, which is really the flip side of the same coin, we think about the security of data, keeping data safe, maintaining the integrity of data, keeping data confidential. So 2 sides of the same coin, and of course you can't have privacy without having security, but they are in fact distinct concepts. And we can go on to really now focus, I think, on the cybersecurity aspects.
Perfect. Let's do that. So why don't we talk a little bit about the cybersecurity threat landscape, which means who are the bad actors out there, what are they interested in achieving, how do they affect companies and individuals, what are they looking for, and why do they hack, and why do they do what they do. And as you and I deal with every day, there are really a number of buckets of threat actors. The first are state-sponsored agents, hackers that are working on behalf of governments to hack into companies or individuals for a variety of reasons. Those primarily in the last number of years have focused around China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are currently the top big adversaries.
Are we seeing Vietnam in there as well?
I think I see Vietnam more as not a player, but a location. We trace attacks back to Vietnam, and that not necessarily Vietnam as a country acting, but as a location where people may or may not set up infrastructure. In addition to state-sponsored agents, there's obviously insiders represent an enormous risk, and people think always when they think about hacking about external forces and people hacking that are hacking from the outside, but a lot of times it's an insider, and sometimes the insider is a malicious insider, somebody that's trying to do damage. But as many of the top breaches in 2018 showed, sometimes the insider is just negligently configuring a server and there's negligent data leakage. For example, upon Amazon Web Services, somebody configures what's called an S3 bucket, which is a repository of web-based data in the Amazon cloud, to be public-facing when it's supposed to be private-facing. So if you look at the top 2018 breaches, about 30% of them are just data leakage because people set up their servers the wrong way.
That happens routinely. Of course, human error is rife in this environment.
Sure, and your data reporting obligations are the exact same, whether somebody maliciously hacked in from the outside or whether they set up a server inadvertently and made it public. The other buckets are people that are economically motivated to hack and do so for monetary gain. Interestingly, over the past couple of years, we've seen a blur between some of the state-sponsored campaigns and the economically motivated hackers, especially in Russia, where sometimes the state governments are leveraging criminal organizations to do what we call the break-ins, and then the state-sponsored agents are coming in behind that. They let the break-in crew take things that they can monetize, and then the state-sponsored crew comes in and gathers information, whether it is to gather information on individuals, to sort of look for people that they can target to be assets for them in the intelligence community, or gain information on, for example, people's opinions, editorial boards' opinions, information about what big companies are thinking about their country, et cetera.
I think that's exactly right. And these are known as APT attacks, advanced persistent threats. And the reason for that is that these folks are retained by governments. They are extremely persistent. We see them sometimes coming online at 9 a.m., for example, Beijing time, and going offline at 5 p.m. Beijing time. They are government workers. So first bucket being APT attacks, nation-state attacks. Second being traditional hackers who are in it for monetary gain. And then I think I would add to that hacktivists, folks who are essentially anarchists who are set out to embarrass, for example, senior executives. Not all of these issues impact personal information. Sometimes we see, for example, source code theft or theft of M&A information or financial data, but very frequently we see theft of personal information. And
Sure.
It is that data that is subject to many, many breach notification laws, both here in the United States and overseas as well. And just to give a sense of the landscape with respect to breach notification, there are 54 laws in the United States, as absurd as that sounds, 50 state laws, plus Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and D.C., where there is an obligation for an entity to notify the affected individuals in the event that there's been a compromise of their data. And we have similar laws overseas as well.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that a lot of the techniques that are used against big corporations are some of the same techniques that are used against individuals. A lot of times individuals are targeted in their individual capacity or sometimes in their capacity as an executive for a big company. Probably one of the top attack vectors still, which is so effective, is phishing, which is somebody sends somebody an email from an email address that looks like a legitimate email address, but is like usually one letter off or a number off. And the recipient doesn't notice that somebody has actually set up a fake domain that looks a lot like the real domain of the recipient. And the recipient clicks on either a link or an attachment, right? Those are the two main rules. Do not click on a link and do not click on an attachment if you don't know really for sure who's sending you this. And as the attackers get more sophisticated, it's unbelievable how much research they will do to make that email look like it's legitimate. They'll do your LinkedIn research, they'll look at your profiles, they'll look at your media clips, they'll look at your organization to figure out who should I pretend I'm going to be so that when I send this email to Lisa, she thinks it's legit and she will click on that link or click on that attachment. So a lot of people fall for that in their individual capacities. In the corporate context, what attackers are doing is they're sending out a number of those phishing emails. It may be to 5, 10, 15, it may be to 100 people. The more sophisticated attackers send it out to a smaller group of people so it doesn't create a lot of noise. But they only need one person to click on anything like that to get a foothold in the organization, because when you click on it, it embeds malware on your computer, and then they try to take over your computer and then move into the corporate network from there.
These are incredibly sophisticated attacks in some cases, and we've seen huge amounts of money going out the door in response to what appears to be a legitimate email exchange with somebody with whom you have been communicating for a while, but then the attacker gets right in the middle of that exchange and then sends wire transfer instructions, for example, to a bank that is not the usual bank. and there goes the money right out the door. So it's quite an insidious threat. And of course, we've also seen just a huge increase in ransomware over the last few years. That's become really just rampant in corporate America and at the individual level as well. I just heard last night about a ransomware attack where the threat actor demanded $500,000, which is quite unusual, $500,000 in Bitcoin. Quite unusual. Usually these amounts are much smaller because they want to make it reasonably painless for you to just pay and get the decryption key sometimes.
Yes.
When in fact you do get the decryption key, which is not always the case when your data is subject to ransomware.
That's exactly right. And you and I and other professionals in the area have helped companies and individuals prepare for these kind of things because you can anticipate how to react to these kind of events, and preparation and education is key. So when you talk about a cyber preparedness program, education and training is an enormous part of it. So for example, on phishing, if you don't educate your staff that this is an attack vector and that they are going to be targeted, your click rate can be 20, 30% of your employees. After professional training on anti-phishing, that click rate goes down to 1%, 2%, 3%, to single digits. So it's not perfect, and this is one of the big problems about cyber, which is the attacker only has to be right 1 out of 100 times, and the company has to be right 100 out of 100 times in order to achieve a defense. But still, you want to slow the attacker down. You want to make it harder than it is to sort of hack the next person down the block, and you want to shoo the attacker down the block to the person where it's easier. Because remarkably, even state-sponsored agents will attack first with the most basic, simple, non-sophisticated methods if they find that they work. Well, we could have Chinese hackers that will use the most obvious cyber hacking 101 methods, because why bring out the heavy guns if you don't need to? You see a lot of books and articles about sort of zero-day attacks where they're cooking up in their cyber labs attacks that nobody has ever seen before. And they will use that against a major defense contractor or a major financial firm if they have to. But if they don't, and the financial firm or the defense contractor has left a door open that you could open with a 101 type of tool, they will use that.
You mentioned insiders as being a threat vector. Also, vendors are a huge source of vulnerability because they have authorized access often to our systems and our data. You could put up fences and gates. You can have a moat surrounding the most secure fortress. But when you put down the bridge to allow that vendor to come across the moat, they have authorized access to get in and to steal essentially the keys to the kingdom. And as with insiders, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes we have rogue vendor employees, but sometimes we have inadvertent actions. And employees of vendors don't know that they're actually providing access to the bad guys, and they're letting the intruders right in the door.
100%. And when I've done security reviews for big companies, let's say they're Fortune 10 or Fortune 50 companies, one of the main problems that they have, which a lot of people don't appreciate because people say, oh, well, you know that vendor management is a big issue. Why don't you solve this overnight? The problem is these companies can have 3, 5, 7, 10,000 vendors. And so those vendors are on a schedule to review their questionnaires that they submit, to review the security responses that they submit in response to those questionnaires. A lot of times in the vendor management departments of these companies, it's hard to get through 7,000 vendors in a year. In fact, you can't. So going through your vendor list usually takes a cycle that is 2 to 3 years long. And so what happens if you don't get to vendor 6,050 until year 3, and it turns out that's the most vulnerable vendor? Obviously, you try to prioritize, and the big companies do this. They don't just do it in some random order. They try to prioritize what vendors have the most access and are the most critical, and let me try to get those in shape. Let's talk about something a little related, which is there's a trend I've noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, that in the area of traditional economically motivated hackers, that credit card breaches at stores using point-of-sale machines, which is the machines that you swipe your credit card through at the stores, has gone down significantly because of the technology that's available for end-to-end encryption. Those have gotten more secure in our estimation, and that has pushed crime towards the e-commerce web-based platforms, and you have hackers injecting essentially credit card number skimming software into the websites where you're going to .com locations to purchase things.
No question. And let's talk a little bit about why. We think in this country about the various sort of underpinnings of data security in the legal landscape, or at least I do as counsel. So we think about what laws are in place at the state level and the federal level, but also what industry standards are in place. And the one that the move of the attackers to e-commerce raises in my mind is the payment card industry data security standard, which has now been in place for a number of years. And while there is little force of law behind it, there are a few state laws that endorse its principles, but really very little force of law. It has become a massively important regime to protect payment card data. And so we now have chip devices at most retailers when you're in store, when you're in the brick and mortar environment. But those same protections don't necessarily carry over to the e-commerce world. So that has absolutely forced a shift from the intruders from the POS brick and mortar world to the e-commerce world.